I think that what I work on and am inspired to work on is awakening to who we really are, because that was something I didn't know growing up. There was nothing in my culture that could really help me to understand really who are we and what are we doing here. And there were some things that were helpful, but I think the most important thing for us to realize is that we are far more than our culture can or has reflected back to us. And so my journey was to try to discover that, both in my own inner experience and then in the historical experience of our ancestors. What is going on? And if we've been given deliberately uh, an image of ourselves that we are really nothing. We're cast out of the garden. We don't deserve to live in the beautiful world of nature. We have done something terribly wrong, and we will have to spend the rest of our lives, and the generations to come will have to spend their lives atoning for it and trying to be saved or fixed or made something we're not. And I now realize that that was a power play by people who wanted to control us. And so I just think it's very, very important that we understand what happened, not with anger, but just with understanding and clarity so that we can move beyond it and really
Mm,
discover some things about ourselves and our creation and why we're here.
absolutely. So you've written a book called The Miracle of Death. And I want to know more about what your understanding is of life after death and how this understanding was shaped by your own experiences and visions.
Mhm. Well, at first, in growing up, I was scared to death of death. And my mother's mother had died when she was young, and her mother had died when she was young. And I was so afraid that my mother would too, that I would be in that line of young girls losing their mothers. And my father was wonderful. I had a wonderful brother, but I really think my soul was carried by my mother. And so I feared it. And my mother had had a dream 2 years before her mother died. And everything happened exactly as was in the dream. And I was so afraid that my mother would die that I too had a dream, just out of that fear that my mother died. And for 2 years, I thought in 2 years she will die. So I lived my life 2 years of just in absolute stress. Everywhere I went, everything I did, I thought, this will be the last time I will do this with my mother. So it was, I really feared it. I couldn't even bear the word, and I couldn't bear the word dream. So that was my outlook on death. And there was nothing in religion that could help me. I mean, they could tell me that, well, we all go to heaven or hell, but it didn't seem very creative. It didn't seem to make sense. And all I knew is that it would be separation, that I would not have any contact whatsoever with that person. And so that was part of my journey in discovering who are we and what is death, because we could accept everything, with life. We can create our worlds. But then if we die, and that's the end of it, because our worldview, our so-called scientific worldview, was that there is nothing but matter. There's no purpose. There's no meaning. You were a fluke of nature. And when you're dead, you're dead. End of everything. That didn't make sense to me because it seemed so phenomenal, all these people and nature. And yet that was the scientific statement. And if you didn't believe that, when I went to university, it's if you didn't accept that, there was something intellectually wrong with you. And now we know, of course, that it's a very limited worldview because the church refused to let any of the scientists study anything but matter because they were definitely afraid of the heretic, that is, the mystic. They were afraid of anyone who would go beyond church doctrine. And so science was so limited. They couldn't study anything but matter. So of course that's all they found. But I didn't know that at the time. And so I was always living with that, the big question, is it really true that there's nothing? Or is there something so much more? And so I started studying world religions and then mythology, symbolic language, and I came into contact with the work of Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, and his work with the right brain's language, symbolism, symbolic language, and how to listen to it and understand our dreams and work with them. And so for much of my adult life, I did that. I really paid attention to my dreams, trying to see where I was going. And then I started studying mythology too. And so then I started mythology division in the college where I taught. And it was one of the most popular classes because that's exactly what all of the students wanted to know. We all wanted to know these things. And it was in the 70s, which was really the big 60s, you might say. There were people really getting started. So we kind of learned together, and it was very exciting. So then I began to see, oh my goodness, look at what our ancestors, they were in on something. They really saw that there is something far more than we've been told by religion or science. And so that was a real opener for me and for many of my students. So that was good. So I was open to real possibilities. And sometimes when we were studying a text, I would say to my students, when the myth would talk about just this complete opening of a cosmic consciousness. And what do we know when we have that? We know that we are immortal, that there is no death, that we are divine. We're all a part of the divine beingness, and we are creators. We have evolved to co-create with the universe. This is magnificent. That's what they know. And that's what they experienced, they knew in the mystic vision. And I would say to my students, I have never experienced this, but I'm open to it. Very clearly, some people have experienced it. And I think we at least, if we want to think of ourselves as intellectuals, if that's meaningful to us, then we cannot throw this away or push it aside. Here are people who are telling us they have experienced this, and we need at least to be open to it. So after I finished my PhD, I thought to myself, I've given it to the left brain. And so I decided that I would go to South America and work with shamans. And I did that twice. And things did begin to open up. We did the drumming, the pilgrimages and out in nature. We took the Inca Trail. We were the first group to actually do the Inca Trail since the Incas. And we used sacred medicine. And so things began to open up. And when I came back home, I was beginning to have some pretty powerful visions. And then our son was killed in a car accident. And he was very interested in this kind of thing as well. And when I look back at my dreams, I kept a journal. I had 2 years in which I had recorded dreams of our son Pishti's death. And I thought it was symbolic. I always looked at it symbolically and hoped it wasn't literal. And then my husband, who was not interested really in this kind of thing, although he was very open to whatever I had to say, the best he could pay attention, because he said, I just never experienced this. I'm trying. But 2 weeks before his son's accident, he was in his office here in our home, and he suddenly saw Pishti's car on the side of the freeway with his body superimposed on it. And he said, I knew he was dead because there were 2 different dimensions. And then he said that I said out loud, oh, that's right, Pishti. It's almost time for you to do this. And he said, that shocked me so that I didn't know what to do at that point. And then Pishti answered in the vision and said, that's right, Dad. I will be out of the house for a little while. And then the vision was over, and Istvan, my husband, totally forgot it. It was just completely out of his consciousness until we got the call that afternoon that Pishti had been in an accident and he was in the trauma center at a hospital. And then it came back to him, but he didn't say anything to me about it until Pishti did die, because he said, I kept thinking maybe this vision is not correct. Maybe he will live, but he didn't. And so then he was in the hospital 2 weeks, and then 1 week we planned the memorial. The next day after the memorial, everything was over. Istvan, my husband, and I were here together, and it was just that, reality that it's over, he's gone. But we just had indications that something else was going on. And so I did a journey that day. And while I wasn't with Pishti so much that day as with, it was like this chanting, native beings chanting in the universe and spiraling down onto the earth to be born. And they were chanting this very, very sacred chant. It just was both heartbreaking and inspiring at the same time. And I realized that the earth has a different frequency now, that people are coming who are already knowing who we are, and they're coming to help us remember. And at the same time, my husband had an experience that when my journey was over, he said to me, Pishti was here. I felt him. And so then we began to do, every weekend, we would do meditation. And once a month, one of us did the sacred medicine journey, which we had learned in South America. And also there were spontaneous visions. I talk about that in the book, that spontaneous things that happened in which Pishti was fully present and talking to us. And Ishvan said that on the way to work, he said it was like I was told, now you can remember. Now that Pishti is gone, it's your turn to remember. And he said it just started flooding in on him, all of this information, like a tape recorder. But then on the weekends, we did it in a very disciplined way. And then we recorded everything we had experienced. And so that's what's in The Miracle of Death, what we had actually experienced. And I was afraid to let a publisher get hold of it because I didn't want it changed. I wanted it to be authentically what it was. And so Kim, who's head of the Kamlak Center, had been a student of mine at the college. And so we were talking about it, and she said, well, I'll just form our own publishing company and we'll publish that book. And so she has been the editor and publisher of everything since. And it's like, I'm sure we talked about this on the other side, before. But that's been good because she's an excellent editor, but she also wanted everything to be authentic. But what changed for me about death after our son's passing was that we were actually in touch with his consciousness. And sometimes we would have hours of conversation. And he wanted us to know, first of all, and this was individually with both me and then with his father. And he wanted us to know, of course I'm alive, of course I am, and I'm perfectly fine, and I'm still working, but I can do more on this side for the project that we're working on than there. I can work with you. And then he wanted us to know that the earth is going through a tremendous transition, and that many people will be coming to the earth to work with us, to help us through this transition. Because of course we've been brainwashed and so much has been censored about who we really are for so many years. And the scientific paradigm or worldview was a result of that censoring. I mean, not the scientists really were not to blame because they were censored. They knew their lives depended on not going into certain, or just like today, there's certain things you cannot talk about, and if you do, you'll be censored. So now these scientists were they had some of the scientists had worked with sacred medicine, and they experienced what they had actually studied and learned in physics. And so quantum physics was in part a result of that kind of higher consciousness. But they all knew, and what we all know when we experience higher consciousness is that death doesn't exist. I mean, yes, the body dies. We step out of this body and we step back into spirit, and we continue to create there, and we can create between dimensions, it was never meant for these dimensions to be separated at all. It's that we've lost that separation and such sorrow. I have met and worked with people who've experienced just the deepest, most profound sorrow because of the belief that there's nothing now, that they will never see someone they've loved with all their lives and hearts. And that's very cruel, and it's a kind of suffering that's hard to bear. So what we really learned is that no, I mean, life continues. And then, of course, when I did more research, I realized, of course, this is what our ancestors always knew, that everything we do here is recorded in the archetypal world. And when we step out of the body here, we are there and we continue and we make the choices for our lives. So it was a very freeing experience from the horrible, fearful view I grew up with. And I think many more, so many people are having these experiences with those who have crossed over.
Life does not necessarily stop as we were told, we are here for no apparent reason, and then we're just not one day.
Oh, yeah, it's just so senseless. And here were such beautiful creations, if you think about it. I looked at my son and thought, such a beautiful young man, and just gone. But then I remember the symbolism of the mandala, how these Buddhist monks will make the most exquisite, detailed mandala, and then shoo, it's gone. But that's creativity. We make something, we create something, and it's here for a particular moment. And then it changes form. But the spirit that makes it, that creates it, is eternal.
I want to ask you, as a parent, and I'm not a parent myself, so I don't know, but I can only imagine losing a child is one of the worst pains anybody can ever go through. How has this understanding and this connection, which is not typical, helped with your grieving process, if you've had a grieving process, or a
Well,
transition into a new type of relationship with your son?
yeah, that's perfectly said. Well, of course, we live in time and space and in matter. And of course, we miss the physical presence of someone we love. And there's just no getting out of that. That is going to be missed. We're going to grieve that. There's no question about it. I mean, my husband then was killed in another automobile accident 2 years later. And my mother had been killed 1 year before in an automobile accident. So everyone in my family had passed over in 3 years. And I remember thinking, but I'm not a mother now, and I will never be a grandmother. But then I thought, of course, if you're once a mother, you're always a mother. and and you can be a grandmother in so many different ways. But the grieving of that absence of that person is going to take place. And you have to recreate your life, in a very different way. And the time that it happens is also, it changes how we get through it. I think there's certain times in our lives we can handle it better, and other times when it's more difficult. And so each situation is very unique. But the fact that I was in touch with him, that we talked, that we saw such a much broader picture in these journeys, made total difference. It was, if I had no contact, not believed there was any continuation, it would have been deadly. But the fact that we could actually be in touch and actually converse was just incredible. And it made the 100% difference. So on that level, I was able to realize every soul must create his or her own life. And certainly as a son, he had taught me as a mother that there comes a time when I have to let him go and make his choices. And I think I realized that this was his choice. Actually, he revealed later it was all our choices, because working together, we had wanted to do certain things, and this is how we were doing it, not only in this world, but in parallel worlds with slight alterations, that I had to respect his creativity and his choices, and let him go, and realize that it was for a larger purpose. And I do think that, so often we think it's just a mistake, it's an accident, it's horrible. If this and this hadn't happened, it would. But I think maybe if we look at it in a broader sense, we maybe can see a little bit better the purpose of our lives. And death is not, it's not a horrible thing. It's an end of a particular physical existence. But if that person continues, that consciousness continues, we have to ask the question, what's going on here? I had a very, very close friend from Ecuador, and when my son was in the hospital, she was there, and she said, I remember her saying, I just wish I knew what he's up to. That was that total acceptance of the meaning behind everything that happens. And we certainly saw that that was true. So, and it was very, very hard for the young woman who loved him, and they had just found each other. They were young. She was 19, he was 20, and they felt they had really found the person, and their lives had been wonderful during the time that they had together. But it was, I think that's a situation in which it's very hard, because here was someone for her who really understood her, nourished who she was, and then suddenly he's gone. It's at different times in our lives, it's harder. And I've certainly come to realize the grief process is different depending on so many things in our lives. So, but yes, being and also not only being in touch with him, but that whole world opening up for me finally, of a higher consciousness of what we're about here, to at least to some degree what we're doing, and what role can I play and be helpful in that sense.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I wanted to check that I understood correctly was that you mentioned having chosen these roles and these experiences to go through in this life before being born. So together, you, your husband, your son. Would this link the experience of personal loss to the evolution of human consciousness? What are your thoughts on that?
That was strange when our son Pishi would say, he wouldn't say like telling us something, he would say, remember, remember. And certainly I knew from my own experience that the most deadly, not to use a pun, but the most horrible experience was death, is losing everything that we ever loved in a moment at any time. So I knew that death was something we don't understand in our culture, and mainly now on the planet, since the Western world has had such a deadening effect on the rest of the world. And so when our son was trying to remind us of that, I thought, well, that makes sense, because the one most important thing we need to know is that there is no death. So if we could come in and go through that and make contact and know that there's no death, remember, and then tell people, then it could be helpful. And so perhaps, we did choose that. There's at first a thing like, how would I choose that? But then later you can know, wait a minute. And why was I so plagued with death as a child? I had the full sense of what that would be. And I just think our planet has suffered so profoundly with death and believing it's the end, that anything we could do, deciding on the other side or here, that would help us to remember that we are eternal, that it's a game worth playing,
I would have never imagined that talking about death is something that can give you so much peace and calm, but it absolutely is.
Oh, yes. And the near-death experiences, I mean, that's a phenomenal happening on our planet, that people are having them and talking about them. And that comforted me long before Pishti's death. I would read those. And I thought at that time there were over 8 million just in the United States, and then all over the world and at all times. And now we just have such incredible experiences of people who've crossed over. And Anthony Shin has done many, and interviewed many people. And there were just so many, even little things, like one man who had no idea about any of this. He said, I realized that even the grass was filled with love that was radiating toward me. And then another woman who'd been an athlete, and they were operating on her, and she could hear the doctors, that it was as though they thought she would die. There'd be no way she could ever even walk again, much less run. And that she saw these light beings enter the doctors and operate on her. It just was so touched my heart to think, I mean, the world is enchanted. It's filled with spirit. If we just can open ourselves to it and realize what an enchanted life we're really living.
Exactly. Now, I wanted to talk a bit about the work that you do around bringing to our awareness the traditions that we seem to have lost touch with. Could you tell me what is your view about these two worlds? And do you think that there's anything in those traditional cultures that could help us today understand the world we live in better?
I absolutely do. And that's why I wrote Merchants of Light, because I started with the early cultures, cave cultures, and the megalithic culture, and old European culture, and Egyptian, and then the first temple tradition of Judaism that was a shaman mystic culture. And then the pre-Socratics we now know were a shaman mystic culture. And there were great scholars in each of these fields who during the 20th century discovered that. There were several scholars, of course, working on the cave cultures even before the 20th century, but a lot of the understanding came that they realized there was a higher consciousness. And then the megalithic cultures, what an incredible culture with these megaliths all around the world that were understood the equinoxes, they understood the solstices, and uh, they built their temples as observatories too, because there was no separation for them. The scientist and the mystic was one. And we could be in those temples, which were constructed in such a way that the electromagnetic field would ignite our frequencies so that we could experience the rhythms of the earth and of the cosmos and synchronize ourselves to that and have the profound understanding. And of course, then by the time the Egyptian culture developed, they built temples. The structure of all of their temples were done in such a way that when an individual entered the temple, they were able to be illuminated and know the message of that temple, not through the left brain, but through the whole being of experiencing and through the heart and the mind. And Schwaller de Lubitz, who was a wonderful scholar in Egyptian studies, said that actually they had the whole of sacred science. And they didn't write it so much in a book for you to read. They had the temple structured in such a way that as you were initiated in each temple, that each temple was a chapter in that sacred science. So that by the time you went through all of the temples, you would have been illuminated into the sacred science, the actual creative principles of the universe. This is so far beyond what we have done so far, although we're beginning to understand it, which is good. And quantum physics, developed in the last century, now is becoming an understanding that is beginning to be worthy of what the universe is telling us. We're beginning to be able to see and understand more. And we know through quantum physics that there are many dimensions, whereas before they said there's nothing but one, matter. And not only are there many dimensions, but we have access to these dimensions. And we know that if two particles are connected in one place and time, they're connected throughout the universe. This is exciting. There's so many things. So I think that these ancient cultures had these secrets. And in fact, at 40,000 BCE, all around the world, shamanism developed. And so we reached a point at which we learned certain techniques or rituals that would help us to move into a higher consciousness. And then cultures developed around that. And but from 621 BCE, there were those, the Deuteronomists, who wanted to destroy that shaman mystic tradition. And of course, later the Roman Church continued intensively to destroy that tradition. But in 621, there still existed the shaman mystic tradition of Judaism. And Margaret Barker was the scholar who discovered that in the 20th century. She's a profound scholar, Old Testament scholar. And she really saw what was going on and saw that it was the Deuteronomists who came in and completely destroyed the connection that that culture had with the right brain and the heart, which was symbolized by the feminine. So they just erased all of the feminine images, including her tree, which was the image of life and love and eternity. So they destroyed it. And later, she feels, and she has evidence to support it, that when Jesus was born, he actually was a renaissance of the First Temple tradition. And he was probably a part of the Therapeutae or the Essenes, who were those who didn't go along with the Deuteronomists. They said, nope, we're not a part of that. We know you're wrong. And they kept their mystical tradition. And out of that group, probably Jesus developed and was a renaissance. And when the church came in, though, they went, no mystic here. He's a god, and you have to worship him, worship something outside yourself. But in 1945, the Nag Hammadi texts were found, which were texts which were used by the early Christians, but threatened to be destroyed by the church. These texts show Jesus as a mystic. And he's saying, I didn't come to save you. I came to remind you of who you are. You know, when you drink from my mouth, you and I are one. And it's not enough to follow the Christ. You must become the Christ. And that was someone really to remind us of who we are. We are these creative, immortal, divine beings that, have forgotten who we are. So it was very, very powerful, but that was censored as well. And those texts, well, they were supposed to be destroyed, but the monks at Nag Hammadi buried them, and they were accidentally found after the war, as were the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those were Jews earlier who wouldn't go along with the Second Temple because they were mystics as well, or Essenes. So anyway, then we have this long domination by the church. But what I show in my book is that these were such powerful creative cultures that they changed people. And when they were suppressed, they would go underground. But then the first time, for about 700 years, the church dominated everything. You couldn't even have a book, you couldn't say anything. And we see people trying to do that today as well. Can't say anything other than the official narrative. That was very much the case. But in about 1000, it just exploded. I mean, it was just blossomed, is a better word, in Europe in the High Middle Ages. And of course, there had been the Islamic culture, which at that time was very highly developed, inspiring the whole European world. And people would go to Cordova, where there were mystic Christians and Kabbalists, the Jewish continuation of the First Temple, and Islamists. They were all there working together. But then it just blossomed beautifully for a few hundred years until, of course, the church caught on and went underground again, and then came up in the Italian, then suppressed again, came up in 1600 with the scientists and mystics in Prague, all the way from London to Prague, suppressed again, then came up in Germany, suppressed again, and just the left brain was allowed to exist, and now it's up again. So these cultures, what did they teach us? They really had the evidence and how to experience who we are and go beyond the censorship.
Now, you also talk about the divine feminine in your work, and you argue that it has been suppressed in our current religious structure. Why has it been suppressed? Why do you think? Is it such a powerful energy?
Yes, the feminine historically has always symbolized each individual's ability to experience a loving heart, cosmic consciousness. If we put it in other terms, we could say that she symbolizes the right brain, which is the symbolic language that gets us in touch with a deeper consciousness. But also she is the heart, flows through the heart because the heart connects us to the cosmos, cosmic energy. So each of us has many brain components. We have the right brain, which develops before the left brain, and it gives information to the left brain. And the left brain is very good if it keeps in contact with its source. It's very good in being able to separate itself out, analyze it, look at the various parts from many different angles, and then it must give it back to the right brain, because the left brain has no ability whatsoever to see context or purpose or meaning. And when it's split off from the right, it actually has the same characteristics of the schizophrenic. And that's what we see in Western culture today. I mean, as people would say, how could someone do that? Well, because they're split off from the heart and the right brain. And we can see from the Deuteronomists to the Roman Church and the censorship of science, and then the French philosophers who just threw away everything but the left brain, how we became a left brain, somewhat schizophrenic society. And if it's not creating, and it won't if it's not connected to the right brain and the heart, then there's a tendency to want to destroy everything, and need for novelty, which it's not getting. So the left brain historically was symbolized as masculine in each of us, and the right brain was the feminine and the heart, the loving heart in each of us. And even in 1700, one of the first theorists of the mind, the brain, knew that he said that the left and right brain must always work together. There must be a dynamic and integral continuum of movement between these two great hemispheres. And he didn't say flow through the heart, but now we know with that must be always that relationship, always working together and flowing through the heart. And in mythology, that's called a sacred marriage, because our left brain, masculine, which is just symbolically so, because each of us has it, marries the right brain heart consciousness. And of course, in the Middle Ages, it just blossomed with the feminine everywhere, because that's what they had omitted. They had omitted and ignored the feminine. And finally, she was back in all her beauty. And how could they relate to her? So it was learning how to relate to the feminine, how to have that integral and dynamic continuum of movement, but through the heart. And of course, Ian McGilchrist in the UK has written recently, scientifically, confirming all of that information. He says, no, the left brain is not masculine, right brain is not feminine. No, it isn't. But symbolically, it has been expressed that way. And the sacred marriages, they're coming together. But he shows how the worst aspects of the left brain, expressed in Leninism, Nazism, fascism, is when the left brain is split off. That's the expression of its illness. So these cultures are very, very necessary for us to realize that we have this dynamic mind, and all of the components must work together. And that the heart, we now know scientifically, is the fifth brain component. It gives more information to the brain than the brain gives to the heart. So to be heart-centered is the sacred marriage, bringing these two dimensions together. And that's really the work of our time.
That's so interesting that you talk about the importance of leading with your heart and of believing our hearts, because I feel that nowadays, as you've mentioned, we live in a very masculine values driven society. And it almost feels that feminine values, or, wearing your heart on your sleeve, being led by your heart or feelings, it feels like a sign of weakness, or it could be seen as a sign of weakness, or of not being perhaps intelligent enough to lead with your brain, and therefore having to lead with your heart. So it's very interesting that you're bringing forward this paradigm that is actually not new at all, but it's something that our forefathers knew.
Yes, absolutely, they knew. And feeling by the left brain has been denigrated. Yes, feeling, I don't care what you feel. I want to know the facts. But that is the lack of wholeness in the left brain. It has no way of connecting to feeling. So of course it dismisses it. That's nonsense. I don't care about that. Well, you need to care about it. Otherwise, we're going to be blowing up the world as we are right now. And so feeling is what the heart teaches us. Feeling is a way of knowing. Sometimes we know something through feeling that we can't quite talk about in the left brain, but we know it. And when intuition, for example, that's also was nonsense. They would denigrate it by saying it's women's intuition, as though if it's something related to the feminine, it's got to be low. But intuition is simply a way that the mind has of bypassing the left brain and going right through the heart. And you know it, you feel it, you intuit it. And it's so important to allow ourselves to do that. But yes, it's been a long, destructive journey in Western culture of denigrating anything that could possibly be related to feminine caring and feeling, a concern for the whole, kindness, love. But I think we're waking up from those limitations. Some are not. I think that those who want to own the world, destroy the world, control the world, are those who are brutally traumatized by the left brain. And of course, the limitation of the left brain always brings a sense of arrogance. You know, it's the heart is not arrogant, but the left brain is. And so they are, of course, they're intellectual. They're the only ones who know, and we don't deserve to be alive. And so they can have a program of depopulation or whatever else they want, because that's what they should do. You know, they don't have the whole brain working. And we need to understand that we're dealing with pathological consciousness. It is, and that they are part of the human species. So how do we as a species heal ourselves? Do I have any complicity in allowing that kind of darkness to develop? So it's a necessity on the part of all of us to allow ourselves to open up that whole mind so the whole mind can experience itself to its fullness and create that light which can heal ourselves and the ones who are desperately pathological as a result of this censorship.
It's so interesting, and you've unlocked for me a completely new way of looking at this. The fact that I mean, I knew before that we're all connected, but looking at those of us that maybe have destructive agendas as a triggered part of our whole, so considering that as the trauma that we carry with us and that with love we can heal, perhaps the answer is light and trying to heal rather than destroy and fight with the
Yes,
same fire.
yes. And I think we do have to be conscious of that illness and what their plans are. I know that many people cannot look at or see or accept some of the things that there is incredible evidence for that are being planned for the species, you know, and they just can't. It's just too much, and they just cannot do it. I think we must call upon ourselves to be strong enough to look at the darkness. We're part of this game. That is a part of our being on the planet at this time. I ask myself, I'm here. Why am I here if I so dislike what's that? You know, I have to look at this more closely. I think it requires real strength to look at the darkness, but not to stay there. We have to then remember the light and how creative we are, and that if we intend to create light within us, we can. We simply visualize ourselves as light beings, allowing the light of the universe to flow through us and into the world and anchor it into the world and heal all of us. You know, so there's always going to be negative and positive, the polarities. When being comes into time and space, there's the negative and the positive, but it needs to be balanced. so that we can create and work together. If there was never anything negative, we'd probably just go to sleep. But we need the balance. And what has happened is it's way out of balance to the detriment of the very ones who want to create the darkness. It's dangerous for them as well as for us. And so it's out of balance. And what we need to do is bring the light so that we can create a balance, so that we can see clearly what's going on, but bring the light to heal it. And we might say, well, we don't know how to heal this. No, we don't. But if we ask for that light, that loving light, we will know what to do in each case.
And that brings me to my final question. How do you see our future? Now, you've mentioned throughout our conversation that there's work that needs to be done, that we're going into a new phase of the world, and that there's a lot of people or helpers nowadays on Earth to help us transition. What does the future look like in your view?
I'm always interested in that question from others. And it appears that, well, one thing that we experienced after our son's death was the merchants of light. That's where the book gets its title. And my husband had a profound vision with our son in which he said, Dad, look up the I Ching. And he gave him, start from the top and go down straight, broken, broken, straight, straight, broken. And that hexagram is working on what has decayed. And our son said to his dad, he said, Dad, read this carefully. It is your work, meaning his and mine, and it is the work of the earth. Like, is to work on what we've allowed to decay. And it's certainly this balance. And then I said to my husband, well, how did you remember the hexagram? And he said, oh, that's easy. It's ML. And I said, ML. But he showed that, with the straight, if you turn it, the hexagram, then you have a straight line, two slanting lines, a straight line, that's M. And then you have a straight line and a flat line, which is L. And I said, well, what's that stand for? And he said, merchants of light. And then he said, and I have it in Miracle of Death, I can't remember it exactly, but it's like these merchants of light are beings, light beings who come to our planet and to help us remember who we are. And it says they sell this knowledge to us for the price of consciousness. In other words, we have our price to them is that we become conscious. But at any rate, I was so amazed with that vision. And then I had earlier a similar vision, but I didn't know quite what to do with it, of the light coming and surrounding the planet, and how now we had to anchor that light into the earth. And I had, the messages were, we will be healed. The people, we have, well, the light that I experienced was, it was the most amazing vision I have ever had. Powerful. The consciousness was so great that I could hardly bear it. And even an hour after it was over, I still was kind of shaking. And when came this beautiful, it was a light disc. I have it in Miracle. And it hovered over me. And then I knew it was like cosmic consciousness, so much that I wouldn't have been able to bear it. But like a transformer, this beautiful feminine being spiraled out of the bottom of it and went through my crown chakra down into my heart. And she began to sing. And she said, you have called us and we are here. Your planet has called us and we are here. So, and she was saying, you have connected to yourselves this day, all those on your planet who are working for love and peace. And I think that, so many people think, well, they're not creating, they're not this, they're not that. No, if we love, if we intend, if we long, we're powerful creators and we're helping to heal the world, even if someone never hears about us. So I felt in those times that they were telling me, we're here to heal. And I knew that the light around the planet, she said, we have been here for eons. Now we can connect to your planet. So I think we're going through an incredible transformation that we can only begin to imagine when this light is anchored in our planet. of love and peace, and we allow it to flow through us, yes, we are going to heal. The planet will heal. I don't know what we have to go through, but I know this is in process. Later, I realized that the merchants of light, I thought my husband, native language was not English, so he'd come up with some funny combinations sometimes. I thought, merchants of light. But then I realized that in my own research, there it was, the merchants of light during the Rosicrucian period, the invisible college. Then I came to realize later through visions, yes, the invisible college does exist. It's a vast mystery school rooted in the other dimension, but working here with us to help us to heal. And there are many such things going on. So with a little shorter answer, I would say, yes, I think that we are really working to remember who we are and allow that light to flow through us and really create the kind of world we would want to bring up our children in and live in. I think we're moving in that direction, but it's going to require some growth and strength and intention on all our parts. And I think it's there. I think it's developing.
I think that's so beautiful. And I love that you have such a positive vision for our future, even though it does, what I'm hearing is that we do have challenges to overcome. We do have work to do. So it does not mean that it will be easy, but it seems that we're working our way towards a more positive, loving, and nurturing future.
Absolutely. And of course, the journey, when there's love in it, there's joy and creativity and excitement. It's a world so beyond what we have created now. We will love it. In spite of the hardships, we're going to see what we're achieving. And nothing is ever achieved alone. Uh, so we're working with beings from many different dimensions.
Now, I know that this is kind of a buzzword right now, and I've been contemplating, I think, in the last 5 minutes if I should ask you that or not. But artificial intelligence, do you see that more of a challenge that we need to overcome, or do you see that as one of those tools that will help us make the world better?
You know, first of all, I don't know enough about it. And I think a lot of us don't. I mean, we're told that it's rolling out and it can completely destroy our species. And so let me just say that my particular experience in the last week with artificial intelligence, Kim noticed these things on, through the internet, and she saw, I think there were 4 different artificial intelligence videos that were made based somewhat on my work. And one was just the first one we watched was just beautifully done uh, and accurate. And it's a little repetitive. You can kind of tell when it's artificial intelligence. And at the end, they were selling techniques to achieve this consciousness, but it was beautiful. It already has over 300,000 viewers. I mean, so I'm thinking, good, people are getting this information. And then there was another one, and I was in it with a few other scholars. And one I will mention is Elaine Pagels, and they had the 2 of us there, and they quoted me as saying something about the Nag Hammadi text. Well, I learned that from Elaine Pagels. She didn't get the credit in that AI. I shouldn't have gotten it. I was talking about her research, and that wasn't reflected. That makes me uneasy uh, because it doesn't seem to be concerned about those things. And even in the first one, it started out saying a lot that I had said, and then it went deeper into quantum physics of things I did not say, but are accurate, but I didn't say it, and it never said I didn't say it. So I'm concerned about that. And then, well, one was in Portuguese and Spanish, so I don't know. And some of the images were not as good. And sometimes the images were inappropriate. And I'm wondering, is there some kind of subliminal message? But I don't know. It wasn't, I think it might have, I don't know. But I can see some real, first of all, tremendous advantages in getting a message across. I mean, one of them, they never mentioned me at all, and they had a lot of my work. In a way, I don't care. I just want the message out. But I did care when it attributed to me scholarship that belonged to someone else. So I just think there's some dangers in accuracy and in well, I'd have to say inaccuracy and inappropriate referencing. But, in a talk, you can't always give, the references, but you at least don't claim for yourself something that, you could, and you couldn't give all the references. Everybody would ho-hum, go to sleep. But the fact that they put the two of us together and had me saying what I had learned from her made me feel very uncomfortable. I mean, she's the one who was the person in the field who learned the language, who taught us. I used her book in my class room years ago. So yeah, those things concern me. On the other hand, thousands of people have heard something. Many of them wrote and said, oh, like in 30 minutes, I learned what I've been trying to learn all my life, or something like that, So, and it was beautifully done, but it can also be done in other ways. So it's something that we need to be very conscious and aware of, and not let it take over. I don't know. Do I make sense with that?
It's a challenge in how do we behave ourselves and how do we treat it, and how do we work alongside it?
I'm 100% with you. And in this country with the media on TV, now newspapers, local radios, they're all bought and controlled by corporations, and especially big pharma. So already we're getting information. For instance, with Robert Kennedy, who's just been assigned the Health and Human Services, I followed his work for 5 years. He's very diligent in working for the health of children and others. And I have heard not one true thing ever said on TV about him. And I'm thinking, why, instead of just opposing him, wouldn't it be great if someone would really check out his work? What are the cases he's prosecuted in the environment? What are the cases he's done for the children? What about the children? If he's telling any kind of truth, why don't we go find out about the children? But we're not critical. People just take those messages as truth, and they're so brainwashed now that they can't hardly get through. And now if we have AI doing the same thing, then we're in for some real trouble. I think the human mind that differentiates and can be critical and make moral and ethical choices is definitely needed. I think so. And I think when something is so totally in opposition to what we think we know, that's exactly what we better read. Read it, no matter how painful it is, take it in. And someone said to me, well, you can find evidence for anything you want to believe. And I said, but that's probably true. But I said, or the statement that, well, there's no way to know the truth. But I think there is a way. I think that there are independent journalists, there are independent scientists and doctors who are talking and showing their research. And so we can take that in, and then I think we have to take in both sides. Here's the so-called science of those who are making billions, and then they have completely censored anyone who disagrees with them. So I felt, well, I better go to those who disagree, see what they're having to say. And you can look at each one of them, listen to their research, and go to one after another and see. Sometimes they're disagreeing, but they're really working on trying to get at the truth. And I think that we can make evaluations of ethics and morals in journalism, and who has continued to look for the truth, who can admit he was wrong at this particular point. I think there is a way of being able to discern the truth, but it will require a mind that is open to both sides, as painful as that can sometimes be. But I do think we can know it. And then if we have wrong information, then we see it was wrong, then we go, we regroup. But I think it's very dangerous to say there's nothing we can do. They're lying to us, everybody's lying to us, so there's nothing we can do. And I think same is true with AI. No, we can see where the dangers are and address them to the best of our ability.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Betty, it has been so wonderful speaking with you and learning more about your work. It's definitely opened up new questions for me, and it's closed some loops as well. So I can't be more grateful for spending this time with you. Now, for anybody that wants to connect with you or learn more about your work, how can they find you? And we've also mentioned a few of your books. So how could they find those books?
Yes, well, The Miracle of Death and Merchants of Light can be purchased any place that sells books, but also the Kamlak Center, Kamlak, uh, also sells the books, but also the website has some articles, webinars, videos, uh, so much what I've been doing, and just finished a film in I think it came out in August, a documentary on Merchants of Light by Anthony Shen, Chene. It's on YouTube, so that's a good one to watch to get a kind of broad picture of the book and of our time.